So hopefully everybody's in. Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Fazzari. I'm director of the Weidenbaum Center. Welcome. It's good to be back for me here in the U.S. Some of you who've been on various other Weidenbaum Center events know that I had taken my first in-person research and lecture trip outside of the country a few weeks ago. It was a great experience. I want to thank the center's incoming director, Andrew Reeves, for leading the last policy launch. I thought it went great. I listened to the recording with interest. And today we have another engaging topic. I am pleased to welcome back to the Weidenbaum Center my former full-time colleague and current part-time colleague, Professor David Levine. David's current full-time position is as Department of Economics and Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Study Joint Chair at the European University Institute, which is located in the outskirts of beautiful Florence, Italy. Earlier in his career, David held the Armin Alshin Chair in Economic Theory at UCLA. In between these deployments, David was a central member of the Washington University Economics Department, and he now holds the title of John H. Biggs Distinguished Professor of Economics Emeritus at Washington University. Let me just comment briefly. Many of you know or have known John Biggs. He was a very important person here at WashU, a member of our board of trustees, and actually got his PhD from the Department of Economics early in my career here. And John's a good friend and great supporter of the university. But getting back to David, David was a central contributor to the redevelopment of the Washington University Economics Department in his years here. And we're glad that he returns to WashU every year to lecture to our grad students and share his research with the entire community. Professor Levine is a very influential economist and economic theorist. He has published research in all of the top journals of economics. I looked at his CV. I think it's approaching 200 entries. That's really incredibly impressive. The work is really wide-ranging, addresses topics in asset pricing, economic growth, game theory, and experimental economics, along with Michele Boldrin, also in our Department of Economics. David has done very influential research on monopoly and property rights. And recently, a big part of David's work explores the formation of social norms and the consequence of those norms for social outcomes in a wide variety of contexts. And this is the foundation for David's talk today. He's given us the intriguing title, Tale of Two Subsidies, Why the Afghan Army Did Not Fight and the Ukrainian Army Did. The topic is obviously relevant to critical current events, but it also provides a broad perspective on lots of different social phenomena that I'm looking forward to hearing about today. So I hope we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end of David's prepared remarks. Feel free to type questions into the chat as things go along. And as your moderator, I'll do the best to deal with those questions as time allows. So David, let me shift the floor over to you. Our technology is a little bit unusual here. If you're seeing David there, he's in the classroom and it's just, he's kind of a small person there, but at least we're able to get him in, and I think you can see the slides fine and should be able to hear David. So floor is yours, David. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be back. Actually, it's been 2 years since I've been here due to the exigencies of travel during the last couple of years, and I'm actually really happy to be back in St. Louis. I'm sorry to be so tiny on your screen. As indicated, we have a little bit of, our technology is maybe not as perfect as we would like. Anyway, I'm going to talk about work that's joint work with Rohan Dutta, who, by the way, was a PhD student here at WashU, and with Salvatore Modica, my colleague from Palermo University in Italy. And I'm going to talk about what might seem mysterious, which is why the Afghan army did not fight, but the Ukrainian army, as we well know, is fighting. And a quote here from Joe Biden about the Afghan army. He said, "We paid their salaries. What we could not provide was the will to fight." And I should indicate, and this is important, we never paid the salaries of the Ukrainian army. And that, in fact, is why the Ukrainian army is fighting and the Afghan army did not fight. So I'm going to lay kind of the background before you, and then I'm going to take you through a series of case studies. And I hope at the end of these case studies, none of which involve armies or fighting, it will actually be fairly obvious to you why it was that the Afghan army did not fight, that this was not such an unexpected thing. So now I can't change the page for some reason. Let me see what I can do here. Okay, so by way of introduction, I want to talk about the idea about public goods and about free riding. So of course, the classical example of a public good is national defense. And the issue is this: we'd all like to be defended, I imagine you'd like to be defended too, but really, I prefer you do the fighting and you defend me. And you probably feel kind of the same way, right? So this is the classical problem of free riding. We'd all like the public good, whether that's defense or something else, but we'd all really rather that somebody else pay for the public good and we can get the benefit of it without paying for it. The same thing kind of works in reverse with public bads. So we get the benefit of cheap carbon produced energy and Bangladesh bears the cost, right? So this is yet another example of kind of free riding. So I think in order to understand why one army fights and another does not, we ought to ask why public goods are provided in the first place. And that is to say, how do we overcome the problem of free riding? So I'm going to talk first to the issue of overcoming the problem of free riding. So I'm going to start with the famous economic theorist, Pigou. And he said, well, you know, altruism, bravery, kind of good-naturedness, this is not adequate to overcome free riding. We're not all going to, you know, volunteer just out of the goodness of our heart to defend our countries or to provide public goods. And indeed, this is true even in the Ukraine. So not all the Ukrainians who are fighting are volunteers. You may recall that early on in the war, Ukrainian men were forbidden to leave the country so that they would in fact have to fight. So basically, the basic idea is that to overcome free riding requires some element of coercion. So for example, in wartime, we have a draft. We tell people either you fight or you go to prison, okay? And another way in which we use coercion is through taxes and subsidies. There are negative coercion through taxes, positive coercion through subsidies. And Pigou said, as an economist, the way to do this is we should provide a tax or a subsidy, depending on whether it's a good or a bad, equal to the social cost, and then the market can take care of providing the public good or getting rid of the public bad. So, for example, if we have a carbon tax, then this will discourage the production of carbon. If the carbon tax is equal to the social cost of carbon, then we'll get sort of the right amount of carbon produced. Similarly, we might subsidize electrical vehicles. In wartime, we have a draft. I'm sorry, the last couple of letters got cut off there, and so forth and so on. This is conventionally what economists have to say about the provision of public goods. Now, there are two rather one famous economist and one famous political scientist who said something rather different. So Ronald Coase is famous for indicating and giving examples of public goods that got provided without taxes or subsidies. Now, in Coase, it's a bit of a mystery. He just says, well, absent bargaining causes, we all come to a good arrangement. In Coase, it just kind of happens. But Eleanor Ostrom, who was much more of an empiricist, told us why it happens. And she said the reason that public goods get provided in these kinds of circumstances where there aren't taxes, there aren't subsidies, there aren't formal policies, is because there's social norms of providing public goods and there's peer pressure on people who do not contribute to the public good, okay? And in particular, she focuses on the use of ostracism as a punishment. If you don't do your share, you're out, okay? And we've approached this from the point of view of modern theory as a mechanism design problem, how optimally to provide punishments to people who fail to do their share. And so there's a theory of how a group can self-organize to provide incentives to each other by monitoring other group members and providing peer pressure on those who fail to conform to the social norm. Now, I just want to indicate, is ostracism a really important punishment? Are people going to go out and die because they'll be ostracized if they don't? So here's a quote from a man who was reluctant to fight in World War I, but he went and he fought anyway. And this is what he said. He said, in those days, chaps joined up or were scorned publicly. This is the famous author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, J.R.R. Tolkien, in a letter to his son. And he's explaining why, even though he didn't want to fight, he went to fight. It was because of the possibility of public scorn if he didn't fight. And you know, you could think about ostracism. Which would you rather have? Would you rather be a year in prison, or would you rather be locked up the rest of your life with plenty of food, plenty of drink, but no entertainment, in a luxury yacht without any contact with any other human being ever? Right? We crave contact with other people. Ostracism is a serious and a real punishment, and people indeed will risk death in order to avoid being publicly scorned. So the ability of groups to provide incentive through peer pressure is real and strong. The problem is it's also somewhat costly. Now, I want to next ask the question about why we seem to see both good and bad social norms. According to Ostrom, social norms fulfill a goal. They provide a public good that would not otherwise be provided. They organize society in a way that's good for the members of society. Now, in Nigeria, per capita GDP is around $2,000 a year, and in Japan, per capita GDP is about $40,000 a year. So the question is, why don't the Nigerians just adopt the social norms of the Japanese so they could be rich like the Japanese? Wouldn't that be to their great benefit if they just reorganized themselves, created new social norms? And this is not a joke, okay? Why do I say this is not a joke? Because in 1868, Japan was similar to medieval Europe. And in 1868, they decided, in fact, to adopt Western social norms. And by 1904, they had transformed into a modern industrial state, then had actually shocked the world by defeating a major Western military power. So during the 40 years of the Meiji era, virtually every aspect of life in Japan was transformed. So it's possible to transform bad social norms into good social norms. And yet we have research that shows that dysfunctional cultural norms can last for centuries. So what to make of this? Okay. Well, in virtually all of economics, we talk about adjustment costs. Very fundamental to macroeconomics is what are called menu costs. The Meiji Reformation in Japan, what was the cost of transforming the social norm? They fought an entire civil war in order to be able to change their social norm from a medieval social norm to a modern Western social norm. Okay, so in the presence of these kinds of costs, okay, it only makes sense to adjust if the benefit of the adjustment exceeds the cost of making the change, okay? And here's the basic idea. Subsidies and social incentives are substitutes. We can use pigovian taxes, or we can use pigovian subsidies, or we can use social incentives. But if we use subsidies, maybe social incentives are not needed. And in that case, it's not desirable to pay the extra cost in order to introduce these adjusted social norms, okay? So one consequence of this is that subsidies can cause social norms to collapse, okay? We introduce subsidies. There's existing social norms. These existing social norms are not well suited to the situation with subsidies. So there's two things that this group can do. At some transformational cost, it can introduce some new, better suited social norms, taking advantage of the subsidies. That would be beneficial. Or they could say, look, the taxes, the subsidies, they're doing most of the work anyway. It would be expensive to come up with something new. Why don't we just abandon the social norms altogether, right? Let's not have this costly for us. Let's not ostracize each other. Let's not pay a big cost of trying to agree on what we ought to do. Let's just go back to the law of the jungle. We'll let the subsidies do our work. We'll be the classical economic man and everybody for themselves. Okay, that's a possibility. If that happens, then the subsidies, by displacing social incentives, can lead to less output of a public good or greater output of a public bad. That is to say, subsidies or taxes are introduced in an effort to discourage or encourage a certain behavior. They have the opposite effect. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. Okay. And I'm going to do this through a series of case studies. And I'm going to start with cartels. And I'm going to start with cartels because economists know a lot about cartels. We spent decades, maybe even centuries, studying cartels. Cartels are groups of firms. They face a public goods problem, right? Namely, every firm has an incentive to overproduce in order to earn greater profits, but that lowers profits for the industry as a whole. Now, there's an old and discredited theory that the disciplinary procedure used by cartels are price wars. And when we see real or apparent cheating, that what the other firms in the industry do is launch a price war in order to punish the one who apparently cheated. That's not how real cartels operate. We know a lot about this. The evidence shows that cartel discipline is achieved through modest individual penalties, very similar to ostracism for real or apparent cheating. And real cartels break down for a different reason. Real cartels break down because circumstances change and it's too expensive to come up with a new agreement. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about adjustment costs. Rather than adopting a new social norm, a new cartel agreement, instead it becomes desirable simply for everybody to go their own ways. And this is a quote from a long article, empirical article about cartels. Bargaining problems were much more likely to undermine collusion than with secret cheating. Bargaining problems affected virtually every cartel in the sample, ending about 1/4 of the cartels came to an end because they couldn't reach a new agreement in the face of changed circumstances. So here's a particular case study. After we wrote this paper, or at least after we wrote the original version of this paper, there was a striking natural experiment. And the natural experiment was this. The COVID pandemic hugely reduced the demand for oil. Now, what effect would you expect this to have on the OPEC cartel? What would you expect a cartel to do in the face of greatly reduced demand? You'd expect they'd reduce their output, right? That's what most people would expect. That isn't what happened. In order to reduce their output, they had to reach a new agreement. They were unable to do so. So, under the old agreement, which was reached prior to the pandemic, okay, output by OPEC was somewhere on the order of 28 million barrels per day. After bargaining broke down on March 8th, and after the agreement expired on March 21st, for the next month, OPEC output, now we're talking here about 2020, this is the very beginning of the pandemic. Oil demand had dropped phenomenally. Lockdowns were affected by March all over the world, okay? OPEC increased its output by about 6%. Okay, in response to an enormous, unexpected negative demand shock, they greatly increased their output. This wasn't a price war. It wasn't a price war. Everybody was still making profits. Price of oil was still way higher than marginal cost. But because they couldn't reach a new agreement, instead of reducing output, which would have been the sensible thing to do, they increased their output. Okay? This is what our theory says should happen when it's not possible or it's too expensive to reach a new agreement. Instead of the decrease in demand lowering output, the decrease in demand increased output. Okay, that's the first case study. The next case study has to do with NGOs in Pakistan. Bono, I forget her first name, Bono wrote a book about this. She had actually embedded in areas of Pakistan. So this is mostly reporting on anthropological research she conducted in person. And she documents how public goods, particularly welfare, which was provided through voluntary efforts, through social incentives. So there was, in the absence of government provision of welfare in a country like Pakistan, there are private voluntary efforts to provide welfare. Okay? These are social norms that you should contribute this. This is enforced through social incentives. Those people who contribute to these welfare efforts are respected. Those people who do not are ostracized. These kinds of goods range from healthcare and education to the defense of political rights. And she has a detailed study of 3 organizations, a political organization, welfare organization, and a madrasa that provides education. And in all of these instances, the provision of these goods, okay, so she first documents how it worked before the NGOs entered. Volunteers provided public goods. Why did they provide public goods? Not because of altruism, not because of some kind of psychological self-signaling, but in response to an informal system of social incentives. As our theory says, this is based on monitoring. For example, right, there's an informal observation of which ambulance services delivered most frequently free services to those in need. Okay? Those ambulance services and the people that ran those ambulance services, stature in the community rose. Those ambulance services which did not were disrespected. Okay? There was also more formal methods of monitoring. For example, the use of receipts to see whether or not people had donated when they were supposed to donate. The incentives were social. People who weren't thought to pull their weight got less respect. Social events such as weddings. If you were a doctor that contributed to a social cause, you were a welcome guest at every wedding. If you weren't so welcome. Okay? this sort of thing. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence in Bono's book about exactly how this worked. It's exactly the way that Oster described. It's exactly as we model in our theory, the social provision of incentives to contribute to public good. What happens with the NGOs? The NGOs, these donor organizations, came into Pakistan. They tried to increase public good provision through subsidies. What sort of subsidies did they use? They paid the salaries of people that contributed to the public good. Okay? What happened? What do we think would happen? These subsidies are a substitute for the social volunteer effort. If they're a reasonably good substitute, then there's no reason to keep up the voluntary organization, and output may actually drop. That's what happened. Bono shows that the provision of social incentives unraveled, and that this actually led to the decreased provision of the public good. The Maternity and Child Welfare Association, it almost collapsed with the influx of foreign aid. 6 community-based organizations in Sindh, engaged primarily in charity and welfare, saw a substantial decrease in provision of services following the arrival of aid from Oxfam. The Aston Latif Welfare Trust collapsed after the arrival of UNICEF aid. In each case, it's what our model says. There's a reduction in public good provision because monitoring and social incentives were abandoned in response to formal incentives. In the absence of the social incentives, volunteer efforts dried up and output actually decreased, the opposite of the intended effect. Okay, you know, I'm going to talk to a certain extent about war and peace and deep issues like charity in Pakistan and oil prices and so forth and so on. This work was actually motivated by a much more mundane observation. The very famous experiment that was conducted by Gnisi and Rustakini many years ago, in which in Israeli daycare centers, they introduced fines for parents picking up their children late. And they observed that as a result of introducing fining parents for being late, more parents arrived late. That sound familiar by now? They penalized something, they taxed it, and the behavior they were trying to discourage increased. So initially there was no fine, and then a fine was imposed. Now, unlike Bono, they don't document how the system worked prior to introduction of fines. In Bono's case, we know how it worked. In OPEC's case, we know how it worked. Here we can say it's likely that parents at daycare know each other and that there's some mild social sanctions to parents who are persistently late. We don't actually know that because nobody actually thought to ask the parents, but we believe that that's probably the case. It's unlikely prior to the fine that parents just picked up their children at the moment of the day that they personally found most convenient. So what does our theory say in this case? Our theory says that we can get now an increase in lateness. Why? Because the social incentives are abandoned and taken over by the fines. And it's too expensive, and particularly since they had no idea how long these fines would last, to organize some new system, right, in the face of fines, to reorganize themselves to be more mild in their discouragement or whatever it would be. Okay, so this was our original motivation. This our theory explained, and then of course we discovered that it applied to a great many other similar incidences. I want to make another point about the school fine case, because the presumption of Gnisi and Rustakini is that the increased lateness was a bad thing. The fines were introduced to decrease lateness went up, and they think it's bad. Now, whether this is true or not depends upon whether or not we're dealing with a closed system, okay? So with small-scale interventions, output doesn't change. The intervention has no welfare consequences and nothing, there's just taxes are collected. With a medium-scale intervention, output jumps up, okay? So the intervention first increases output, then it declines, and welfare decreases. But here's the thing. Here's the essential point, okay? The point at which the group gives up social incentives is a point at which they're indifferent between keeping the social incentives and abandoning them, okay? At that point, because it's expensive to operate the system, they surely are going to abandon it. That means that even before they reach the point of indifference, it's optimal to abandon social incentives. That means what? It means, first of all, that output goes, well, in this case, lateness goes up, But second of all, it means that if the revenues are recycled, if the school is a closed system, so the school's getting more money, so the parents pay a little bit less, so that the money is not lost to the parents, then everybody is actually better off. So we introduce these fines. We observe that lateness goes up, and the correct conclusion is that that made people better off. So it was designed to decrease lateness. Actually, lateness increased, but that was a good thing, okay? Now, that's true in a situation like the school where it's a closed system. It's not true with subsidies. And it's not true with taxes where outsiders take the taxes. So let's talk about what happens when outsiders take the taxes, okay? So I'm going to talk about tax repeal, because groups have options that are not available to individuals. So a tax is introduced. Our group is paying this tax. One possibility is to get together, reorganize ourselves, adopt our social norms to the presence of the tax. It's costly to do this. If we're going to undertake those costs, while we're here arguing about how we should adopt our social norm to the taxes, maybe we want to do something else as well. Maybe we want to engage in political action. Maybe we want to get the taxes repealed, okay? If you're going to renegotiate, maybe it's good not only to introduce a new social norm, but also to engage in tax repeal. So we've seen tax repeal movements throughout history, right? Individuals can't do much about taxes, but groups can. Ranging from peasant revolts in China, in 500 BC, we've had no ends of revolts over high taxes. Proposition 19 in the United States, I don't think I have that on my slides. Okay, here's the tax repeal. Okay, so here's a case study in tax repeal. Okay, here is a tax that was introduced to serve a social goal, to reduce speed, because speed is bad for people. Get killed on the highway. So this happened in France. So here the thing that's being taxed is speed. The intervention was to lower the speed limit, right? That makes it more costly to go fast because you have to pay more in fines. Okay. In particular, in July of 2018, the French federal government lowered the speed limit on secondary highways from 90 kilometers an hour to 80 kilometers an hour. The evidence is that the reason they did this, right, was to achieve the social goal of lowering accident rates that were considered to be too high. Now, the bulk of the impact of this increased tax fell on rural communities where there were no primary highways and where secondary highways were widely used. So people don't, even in the absence of speed limits, social norms are important. The drivers who are perceived to be driving excessively fast are often informally punished. For example, people who kind of get in their way and slow down and try to make it hard for them to get through. The extreme example of this is in a wonderful film by Damien Sisfron called Relatos Salvajes, which details a long fictional road rage incident where each tries to discipline the other, resulting ultimately in some horrible catastrophe. So, what does our theory say? It says if it could do so at low cost, in response to this lower speed limit, it would not only set a new driving speed norm, but it might also like to try to lower taxes. And that is what happened. The rural groups organized themselves, and they didn't focus so much on incentives against speeding, they focused on lowering taxes. How did they go about lowering taxes? They destroyed all the traffic cameras. Okay? The rate of traffic camera destruction jumped by 400%, and the year following the speed limit, about 75% of all traffic cameras in France were destroyed. They were then replaced by indestructible cameras. The indestructible cameras were then destroyed as well. So this is an unusual form of tax repeal. People think of the yellow vests for the riots that they conducted in Paris, but much less well known is the tax repeal that they conducted on the rural highways in France. So here's an unintended consequence. A tax is imposed to discourage speeding. The consequence was that the tax was repealed. Instead of the speed limit being 90, the speed limit essentially disappeared. Why did the speed limit disappear? Because there were no longer any traffic cameras to enforce it. So the speed limit didn't go from 90 to 80, it went from 90 to infinity. Okay? Unintended consequence. Why? due to social organization, social norms, and peer enforcement. Right? So these are my case studies. I now want to talk about different ways in which we can subsidize things. So a pigovian subsidy says subsidize the activity. Typically that means, for example, subsidizing the salary of group members who provide effort. That's what the NGOs did in Pakistan. Let me suggest an alternative kind of subsidy. This is not a subsidy well liked by economists. I could describe this kind of subsidy as an output multiplier. So instead of in Pakistan paying employees to provide services, give them ambulances with which they can provide the services themselves. Provide equipment, provide training that increases the effectiveness of effort provided by group members. Now, what's the difference? A pigovian subsidy is a substitute for social norms. Even if there's no peer pressure, the public good will be provided. If we provide an output multiplier, then it's a complement of social norms, right? If there's no social pressure for service, if there's no volunteers, then all this equipment and training will be wasted. The only way in which it's possible to take advantage of the provision of this equipment and this training is if volunteers, social norms, peer pressure provide the public good, right? And that's what happened in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the Afghan army did not fight because we paid their salaries. And the Ukrainian army is fighting because we do not pay their salaries. We use the right kind of subsidy for Ukraine. We give them weapons, we give them training. We use the wrong kind of subsidy for Afghanistan. We paid the salaries of the army. And the consequences of this are predictable. The pigovian subsidy substitutes for social norms and leads to a reduction of output, an army that doesn't fight. Provision of aid that is a complement for volunteer effort and social norms. If the Ukrainians want to defend themselves, they have no choice. They have to fight. We can help them, we can make them more effective, but we don't pay their salaries. Thank you. That's actually the, I was told try to keep it under 50 minutes. I think I even managed to do that. Steve, you were worried I had too many slides.
I was worried, but I'm not worried anymore, David. Are you hearing me there? Good. So,
now I think we can go to questions.
Yeah, I know this is good. It's a fascinating talk. I wanted to point out to the audience broadly, you mentioned Lynn Ostrom early on, Eleanor Ostrom. We knew her as Lynn. So she was actually an important part of Washington University back in the day. She was connected with Doug North and the New Institutional Social Sciences and was here a number of times. So that connection is strong, as was Ronald Coase, actually, and people are connected to his his work as well. And you're carrying it on there further. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. People should feel free to
Could you read this, Steve? I don't seem to have the chat visible.
That's okay. I'll take care of it. I'll moderate them for you. So let me start with an interesting question from Peggy Symes about COVID subsidies. So we were subsidizing, at least some states subsidize COVID vaccines. I'm not quite sure what Peggy has in mind. There are various kinds of things there, but would your theory suggest that it's a bad idea to pay people to get vaccinated if we've got this public good problem of trying to limit transmission of the virus?
So potentially, there's different kinds of subsidies that were involved. So first of all, I believe it was the case that nobody was charged for the actual cost of the vaccine, right? So that was one form of subsidy. I believe another form of subsidy was that the services, I don't know if they were paid. I promise, I got my vaccinations in Europe. In Europe, the vaccinations were provided by unpaid volunteers. I don't know whether that was true here or whether there were paid professionals who delivered the vaccines, although I believe the people who received the vaccines did not have to pay. I gather there was an additional form of subsidy, which is I believe people were actually given rewards or money for showing that they had been vaccinated or something like that, right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. In some states, there's some money and some lottery tickets and that kind of stuff.
Right. So clearly there was an important element of social norms and peer pressure and people getting vaccinated. I think we all would recognize that there was people around us pushing us to get vaccinated, and that there was certainly a lot of the sentiment of be vaccinated or you're a jerk or something like that. Maybe there was other groups where it was the opposite, but there were certainly groups where there was a lot of peer pressure. So potentially, yes, paying people to get vaccinated potentially could substitute for the peer pressure, getting people vaccinated and reduce the number of people being vaccinated. My impression, which is a very vague impression to be sure, is that the incentives in the form of paying people were so minuscule as probably not to have made much difference one way or the other. Right, I recall reading a few stories about somebody that won a prize or something because they got a lottery ticket because they got vaccinated. But I didn't have the impression that anybody was getting paid enough to really make it worth your while. So I'm not sure. So the point is that every time you subsidize anything, things collapse. Right? You have to subsidize it enough that it really substitutes. And I'm not really sure that that was the case of paying people to get COVID vaccines. It's difficult to say without my knowing more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't think it was that big of a thing, but it's interesting to see how the basic framework leads you to think about this issue, where it's again a simple kind of pigovian supply demand perspective, which is say, oh yeah, if we give somebody a subsidy, they're more likely to do it.
I'll be honest, I hadn't thought of that, but the fact is, when we raised the point, it's pretty clear to me that there's a very strong element of social pressure for people to get vaccinated. And I don't doubt there are people who are reluctant to get vaccinated, got vaccinated because people were making them feel guilty for not vaccinated. I know this is true for people that vote, right? Lots of people vote because they feel that they're basically people are gonna sneer at them for not voting. And people got vaccinated because they were afraid that family, relatives, friends would look down on them for not getting vaccinated. So once that's in place, we have the possibility of subsidies having a negative effect rather than a positive effect.
Yeah, very, very interesting. To go more to the topic of your title, we have a few questions in here about specifically Afghanistan and Ukraine. So one is related to the Afghan army. So we on the one hand, we paid them, but there was also the kind of output multiplier. The slide is still up there. That you got the output multiplier point there. We did provide lots of equipment, lots of training, things along those lines. Does that change the perspective? Does that add nuance to the analysis?
Okay, so it does. So it's true. So I haven't attempted to do the mathematical version of this paper. So the mathematical version of this paper, which by the way was published in the St. Louis Federal Reserve Review, so also a local thing. We looked at both kinds of subsidies in tandem, right? And the answer is it depends, right? It really depends. If the salary subsidy is small and the in-kind subsidy is big, then you wouldn't really expect it to displace the effort of the volunteer provision, right? It wouldn't replace social incentives. If the salary was big and the in-kind provision is smaller, then it could lead to the collapse. We actually have a lot of evidence that there was no interest on the part of Afghan soldiers in fighting, right? So there's no evidence. What that tells me is that there wasn't peer pressure in place that people should join the army in order to defend their country. So I would contrast this either with the Ukrainian case. Now, not every Ukrainian is there because they're forbidden to leave the country. Not every Ukrainian is fighting because they really want to fight. Some Ukrainians are fighting because the peer pressure on them to fight is enormously high. That's why Tolkien went to war, because the peer pressure was enormously high. I don't see any evidence that people were joining the Afghan army, maybe small numbers. I mean, not the case that none of the Afghan army fought, but it is no evidence that the bulk of the Afghan army joined the army because they felt peer pressure. They should be in the army to defend their country. They should be in the army because the salary was good and so forth and so on, but not to defend their country. And when the time came to defend their country, it seemed they had very little interest in doing so, right?
Yeah, so it's again, it's nuanced.
It's hard to know, because maybe if we hadn't subsidized their salary, maybe they still wouldn't have wanted to defend their country. Maybe they don't mind the Taliban that much, right? There's also that. So it's clearly much more nuanced than
lots of things going on, but again, really interesting framework and a perspective that you just wouldn't hear very often. There's a question in the chat, which I think is a tough one, but you are an expert in game theory and incentives and things like this. So one of the questions that has come up is, how do you get Putin to stop this brutal war? What kinds of incentives? And we've got, we have the sanctions and the economic punishment and trying to put pressure on the elites, international ostracism. I'm sure you've thought about this.
I guess the question partly revolves around what you mean by end the war. So actually, I know quite a fair amount about this, but not in the context of this particular research, but in the context of research on conflict and what leads to prolonged conflicts. So the reason the conflicts go on a long time is because outside powers intervene to prevent either side from losing. That's probably a pretty accurate description of what's going on in the Ukraine. It's pretty clear that NATO is prepared to prop up the Ukrainians so that they can't lose. It's pretty clear the Ukrainians can't successfully invade Russia. So potentially the war can go on forever as long as neither side is allowed to lose. Now we can look for, if you want to look at a positive picture, if we really wanted to end the war and we didn't care too much about the terms in which it's ended, we would go to the Russians, we would agree on where the country gets split down the middle, right? And then we would guarantee, NATO would guarantee the border. Where does this succeeded? In North and South Korea. There's an armistice line. That armistice line has been in place since the Korean War ended, which was sometime in the 1950s. Neither side has ever agreed to have peace with the other side. The war technically continues, but it is essentially a harmless war. The two sides that are propping up, so basically the Chinese propping up the North Koreans and us to a certain extent propping up the South Koreans, have put a border lines right next to each other. Our red lines are adjacent, so there's no scope for fighting. If the Russians put their red line at the Donbas region, and we put our red line around Lviv or someplace like that, we leave the whole rest of the Ukraine open for fighting. And I promise you in that case, fighting will go on for a very long time. Maybe there'll be temporary ceasefires. I say this not happily, but I say this with the benefit of substantial data on civil wars. I don't know if most people understand how long civil wars go on for when they're propped up by outside powers, but I'm talking about decades, not years.
Yeah, that is discouraging, given what's happened there. I was wondering also, kind of keeping with the U.S. military theme, and maybe going back a little bit more to the more specific framework of your talk. So in the U.S., there's been a big change. Certainly from World War II to the current period. I would probably even be more like from Vietnam to the current period, of moving away from a draft and to some extent social norms, although the draft is clearly coercion in the Vietnam era. Having been just young enough to avoid that, it's quite relevant to me. There was clear coercion going, with that draft for sure. But then moving to this all-volunteer army where we're paying people, and I'm just thinking out loud now, but I'm thinking that kind of again fits the framework where people can now say, well, if you want to go join the military, it's your choice, and so it goes.
We generally pay soldiers.
Right.
The question is more one of whether it's outsiders paying the soldiers or us paying the soldiers. But the issue with the all-volunteer force is whether or not people join simply for the salary, which is probably not by and large the case, because the salary actually isn't all that great, or whether there's some element. If you actually, at the first time the all-volunteer force was introduced, which was back in the mid-70s, I was actually involved with the RAND study on military manpower, and I spent a fair amount of time interviewing military members of the military in the different branches, right? And I can tell you that these guys were not in the military in order to get a good salary. That is particularly not the case in the Army and the Marines, right? These are guys, because being in the Army isn't just getting a salary, it's living in the mud and in huts and going on these crazy things, right? They did it because that's what they wanted to do. And I would point out as well that after September 11th, 2001, there was an enormous increase in people volunteering to join the military. And some of that was, of course, because people were angry and wanted to join the military, but there was also a tremendous amount of peer pressure involved. People who joined the military commanded a great deal of respect at that time. Okay. This wasn't so much true in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, but I've seen in the US military all along, right? So I've seen for a long time that there's clearly social elements that people are joining in order to defend their country, not merely to get a salary. We didn't see that in Afghanistan. Now that increased greatly after September 11, 2001.
Yeah, interesting how the framework
As an
comes
example, of social incentives, even to this day, so it's now, what, 21 years later, right? Go wait for boarding on an airplane and see who gets to board first. Active duty service members, right? So what is this? This is a sign of respect, of public respect for people that join the military, right? Is that not?
Makes perfect sense. And there's certainly that. There's certainly
But this is purely, I mean, the government is not mandating that airlines let active military on first, as far as I know. This is just the airlines being part of a social norm that says we should respect people for joining the military because they're doing us a service.
Yeah, and just that phrase, "Thank you for your service,"
Right.
is very common and kind of integrated throughout society, which seems to fit the framework you're talking about. Actually, I've got another question here, which I will digest. But before I get to that one that came to my mind was you talked a bit about OPEC and carbon taxes and things like this. So we have the experience, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but just the conventional wisdom is that the tax on the sulfur dioxide tax for acid rain was really quite effective in kind of standard pigovian ways, and now, of course, we've been debating for quite a while about carbon taxes, and we haven't gone there in some respects. So I should probably let you comment on this, but just one thought is I'm thinking about carbon policy in particular, and maybe this applies to the utilities and the sulfur dioxide. There really isn't maybe that much of a personal social norm. I suppose I could drive a Prius, if going back a few years, or an electric car is to kind of show that I'm a good citizen and trying to do my best for the planet. But that doesn't sound to me like a very effective social incentive. It may be very difficult in this context to generate the kind of social norms that would lead us to decarbonize, and even harder in the case of electric utilities. I mean, what would you have done back there?
So I would say two things here. The problem with pigovian taxes aren't high enough. If you set the pigovian tax all the way to the full tax rate, then it doesn't matter that you kill the social incentives because you get the right amount of output anyway. The problem is if you set a lower level, you may have a problem. Second thing I would say this, there is a social element in carbon as well. Everything, people who trade informally in tax credits for flying on airplanes, people who in various voluntary ways try to reduce their carbon footprint. And this is enforced by peer pressure in certain social groups. It's considered, for example, eating meat is considered bad because it contributes to carbon. You should ride a bicycle. No, these are real social norms. I would say the problem is this. The problem is that the carbon, these might, as far as Western countries go, be enough. We're on despite it wasn't Donald Trump who said drill baby drill, but he might as well have, right? We're going to dig coal, weren't we, under Donald Trump? Well, coal usage declined throughout Donald Trump's presidency. So the point is, in the West, carbon usage is declining for a variety of reasons. Not in the United States, which certainly, unlike Europe, hasn't tried to do various things specifically, has also had declining carbon, as well as Europe, where they've taken more active measures. But my question would be, I'm not sure how much these social incentives do for keeping Bangladesh from building a lot of cheap coal-fired plants. And that's where the future problem comes, right? I don't see how it gets China to reduce their coal-fired plants. I don't see how it keeps Bangladesh from building coal-fired plants. So part of the thing is, if you look at the big picture of carbon, right, the countries that both have the most to lose and the most to gain are relatively poor countries like Bangladesh. Right? They have a lot to gain because they're poor and they can benefit a lot from cheap energy, and coal is cheap energy. And they have a lot to lose because they're located in parts of the world that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, right? So in that sense, I don't think social incentives are really so important. I don't think imposing carbon taxes on Bangladesh is going to work because I don't see why they're going to agree to it in some sense. I would think the carbon subsidies or anti-carbon subsidies for Bangladesh would be a lot more effective. And if we did that rather than spending money on electric buses, I think our money would be a lot better spent. But that would, on the one hand, it wouldn't substitute for the informal incentives we have in the West. On the second hand, it would provide reason for places like Bangladesh to invest in solar and other power rather than coal, because we'd be subsidizing the cleaner power. So.
Yeah, interesting. So the question that came in was from our also Emeritus colleague Lee Benham, who was very connected to Lynn Ostrom and Ronald Coase and Doug North and some of the people that you mentioned early on in the talk. And so I'll basically read Lee's question. He said the British Navy was very successful for a long time, at least in the early period. The rewards for capturing a ship or winning a battle could be very large indeed. If a British captain did not engage properly, the official sanctions were harsh. So what do you say about that? Is that relevant? Does that sound relevant to the analysis?
I would agree. I would agree with most of these observations. I think the evidence is within the military discipline is important. If there's no consequences for people running away from battle, I think we see a lot of people running away from battle. But this has to do with battlefield conduct. What happened in Afghanistan was something different. Right? It wasn't that individual soldiers ran away because there was no discipline in their ranks. It's that the army agreed collectively not to fight, which is a different matter, right? And the British Navy, whatever were the penalties internally, right, certainly could have collectively decided not to fight if they didn't want to fight. There was no real way you could enforce on the entire Navy, right, the discipline. So there's a difference between sort of the micromanagement of the military, the sergeants and the non-commissioned officers who kind of carry the army forward in fighting, right? And the bigger question is, what is the motivation of the military as a whole?
Well, thank you, David. We're running up against our ending time. I think this has just been a really wide-ranging discussion of a framework that is so relevant to so many different places, including Ukraine and Afghanistan, the title comparison, but it goes much beyond that. So, thanks for taking the time with us, and I'm glad we had a good discussion. Lots of interesting examples. I just want to let people know that the Wiedenbaum Center will continue its series of popular policy lunches. We have one a week from today at noon, where we'll be talking about, again, a little bit about Ukraine, but in particular, the reaction of India to Russia. Also, we'll be talking about some issues in American politics, and I'm going to share some comments about monetary policy and inflation, which I know is a big topic these days. So I hope that many of you will join us noon next Wednesday, April 20th. And again, let's thank the John H. Biggs Professor Emeritus at Washington University, David Levine. This would be a time for a good round of applause, which is kind of hard to get remotely, but I hope you can feel that love from us, David. Thanks again.
Do the famous Zoom wave. I don't know if you can see me waving. Thank you. You guys have been a great audience. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure. I like to do this. I hope to do it again. So till this time next year, I suppose.
Okay, we hope to do it. Thanks to all, and we'll stop the session here.